Welcome to The Deep Dive, your essential guide to understanding the moments that reshape the world. Today, we are not simply recounting a siege. We are witnessing the catastrophic final hours of a 1,500-year empire. We are plunging into the collapse of Constantinople on 29 May 1453, a date recognized by historians as the effective end of the Roman epoch and, well, the violent, dramatic birth of the early modern world.
This is a monumental deep dive because the event itself wasn't just a military victory. It was a critical watershed moment driven by a radical shift in technology.
Right.
For 8 centuries, the city's massive, legendary defenses were considered the gold standard of military engineering, standing virtually invincible.
And here is the profound paradox we need to unpack for you. Those magnificent, ancient fortifications designed to withstand battering rams, sapping, and conventional siege warfare were suddenly brutally rendered obsolete.
Exactly. They were defeated not by superior tactics alone, although tactics played a part, but by the overwhelming sustained firepower of massive gunpowder artillery.
It's the ultimate historical example of tradition being shattered by innovation. A real turning point.
Absolutely. A clash of eras, really. Hashtag check your chapter 1, the twilight of an empire. Hashtag I.1, the city is Constantinople's legacy before 1453.
We begin with the grand, beleaguered capital itself. Founded and consecrated by Constantine the Great in 330 AD, Constantinople was the imperial capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, truly the city of cities, the unrivaled hub of trade, wealth, and culture for a millennium.
For a very long time, yes.
But by the 15th century, that glorious shine had faded dramatically.
Oh, dramatically.
Yeah.
The city possessed a staggering legacy of resilience, though. You have to remember, it had faced countless sieges from Avars, Arabs, Russians, various rivals.
It seemed untouchable for so long.
It did, and yet it had only been successfully captured once before. The devastating 1204 sack of Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade.
A disaster.
That event was catastrophic. It shattered the Byzantine state, replacing it with an unstable, short-lived Latin kingdom. It left deep scars.
And while the city was eventually retaken by the Nicenes in 1261, the restored empire never really regained its former geopolitical or economic strength, did it?
No, not even close. It was perpetually under threat, fighting off Serbs, Bulgarians, and the relentlessly aggressive Ottoman Turks who were just swallowing up territories across Anatolia and the Balkans, inch by inch.
So by the time we get to 1453, what did the city actually look like?
By the time of the final siege, the city was a shell. You can trace its rapid decline through population figures. The Black Death, which swept through between 1346 and 1349, killed almost half the inhabitants.
Half? That's staggering.
It's unimaginable. Economically exhausted and politically isolated, Constantinople had dramatically shrunk. It was described by contemporaries as nothing more than a series of walled villages, separated by vast, overgrown fields, all still enclosed by those magnificent Theodosian walls. The empire itself was reduced to the city, the Prince's Islands nearby, and a small foothold in the Peloponnese centered at Mistras. That was it. Hashtag I.2, the shadow of Mehmed. A new sultan with an old dream.
The definitive looming threat arrived when Mehmed II succeeded his father in 1451. He was just 19 years old.
Just a teenager, really.
And the reaction across Christian Europe was initially one of relief, wasn't it?
Oh, completely.
Yeah.
That relief was, well, it was misplaced and based on dangerous assumptions. European courts celebrated the young ruler's ascension, assuming that his inexperience would lead to a period of internal disarray, maybe postpone any major challenge to Christian states.
Underestimation on a grand scale.
Totally. They saw a boy where they should have seen a visionary strategist with a single burning ambition.
And Mehmed's actions immediately and, frankly, violently contradicted this assumption.
Right away. By early 1452, less than a year into his reign, he launched an aggressive strategic maneuver. The construction of the massive fortress Rumeli Hisarya on the European shore of the Bosphorus.
Directly opposite an older Ottoman fort.
Yes, Anadolu Hisarya on the Asian side. This was a declarative act of war. The combined position allowed Mehmed to enforce complete control over all sea traffic passing through the strait.
And the name they gave it is quite telling.
It really is. Baraskasan. It translates literally as strait blocker, but chillingly, also as throat cutter.
Throat cutter. That sends a message.
Doesn't it just? By controlling the throat of the strait, he effectively choked off the city's last reliable route for communication and supply from the Black Sea colonies. The noose was tightening. Hashtag I.3, Byzantium's last emperor, Constantine season, Paleologos.
Facing this overwhelming and rapidly escalating threat stood Emperor Constantine VIII Paleologos. He knew his only viable hope was a massive military intervention from the West.
His only hope, really.
But that hope demanded an enormous price.
Yes, the price was the fulfillment of the union between the Eastern Orthodox and Western Catholic churches, a union painfully negotiated at the Council of Florence way back in 1439.
A deeply controversial issue.
Extremely. Constantine was forced to formally declare the implementation of that union valid in Constantinople in December 1452, hoping it would spur immediate military aid from the Pope. A last desperate gamble.
But this religious concession was tragically divisive within the city itself, wasn't it?
Fatally divisive. You had fierce internal resistance from the Orthodox majority, the anti-unionist partisans, who viewed Latin Catholicism as heresy. This deep-seated division was rooted in centuries of antagonism.
Going back to the Crusades.
Exactly. Exacerbated by things like the 1182 massacre of the Latins and, of course, the lasting trauma of the 1204 sack. This latent ethnic hatred, as some historians call it, crippled the unity needed for a comprehensive defense just when they needed it most.
So the hoped-for aid never really materialized in force?
No, the promised Western contribution proved utterly futile. Pope Nicholas V, well, he lacked the centralized power to command Europe's fractured kingdoms. France and England were still tangled up in the final decades of the Hundred Years' War.
Spain was busy with the Reconquista.
Right. And the memory of the massive Christian defeat at the Battle of Varna in 1444 still loomed large. Nobody wanted another disaster like that.
So only a few came.
Only a few heroes, really. Cardinal Isidore arrived with 200 archers. And crucially, the Genoese military expert Giovanni Giustiniani came with about 700 well-armed men from Genoa and Chios.
Giustiniani would prove vital.
Immensely.
Yeah.
But overall, it was a paltry sum against the rising Ottoman tide, the failure of the West to unite and act. It's perhaps the greatest political tragedy preceding the fall. Hashtag I.4, the walls of Theodosia's pride and decay of defenses.
Before we delve into the siege itself, we must pay tribute to the incredible defensive system that protected Constantinople for 8 centuries, the Theodosian walls. What made them so effective against previous enemies?
They were a true masterpiece of early medieval defense engineering. They stretched about 5.5 kilometers, that's roughly 3.5 miles, across the landward side, which was always the most vulnerable approach.
And they weren't just one wall, right? It was a system.
Exactly. An intricate, layered system. First, you had a huge moat, maybe 60 feet wide, often filled with water. Beyond that lay a low outer wall called the proteasma. And finally, the massive intercrenellated wall studded with these imposing towers every 45 to 55 meters or so.
How did this layering actually work against older siege techniques?
Well, the layers acted as a buffer against everything the Byzantines had faced before gunpowder. The wide moat made it incredibly difficult for enemies to use siege towers effectively or bring battering rams right up to the main inner wall.
Kept them at a distance.
Precisely. And if an enemy somehow managed to breach the outer wall, they found themselves trapped in that narrow space between the two walls, the peribolos.
A killing zone.
Absolutely. Exposed to lethal missile fire, arrows, stones, Greek fire from the high inner wall and its towers. And crucially, the moat and the sheer scale of the structure made successful sapping tunneling underneath to collapse the wall extremely difficult. It was essentially proof against pre-gunpowder methods.
Yet, as we foreshadowed, these walls, which withstood nearly 1,000 years of traditional sieges, were about to meet a force they were never designed for.
That's the crux of it. This is the moment where military history turns on a dime. Technology was about to overwhelm tradition in the most brutal way imaginable. Constantine, to his credit, ordered repairs and fortifications, especially on the weaker Blaternay section, but it was like patching a dam against the tsunami. Hashtag I.5, the gathering storm, early omens and preparations. Mehmed's preparations in the months leading up were meticulous. They really demonstrate his absolute commitment to this single goal, taking the city.
He left nothing to chance.
Nothing. In late 1452, he moved to neutralize any potential aid from the remaining Byzantine fragments down in Greece. He dispatched Turkan Beg to the Peloponnese with a large garrison specifically to prevent Constantine's brothers, Thomas and Demetrios, from sending crucial aid from Mistras.
Cut off potential reinforcements. Smart.
Very. And then there was a logistical effort required to bring his new weapon, the destructive artillery, to the city halls. That was staggering in itself.
Transporting those enormous cannons must have been a nightmare.
It was a major engineering feat. The cannons were cast in Adrianople, which was Mehmed's capital at the time. A commander named Karaka Pasha oversaw the logistics of moving this massive artillery train.
What did that involve?
It required mobilizing something like 50 skilled carpenters and over 200 artisans, just to prepare and reinforce the roads and bridges for the transport. We're talking about hauling these massive bronze tubes, some weighing many tons, hundreds of miles over rough terrain. It underlined that the investment in gunpowder wasn't casual, it was total.
Constantine, meanwhile, knowing time was running out, made one last desperate attempt at diplomacy, didn't he?
He did. He sent ambassadors with gifts, probably hoping to somehow appease the Sultan or at least buy more time, delay the inevitable.
How did Mehmed respond?
Mehmed's chilling response was immediate and absolute. He summarily executed the ambassadors.
Just like that.
Just like that, signaling unequivocally that negotiations were over. The only path forward was war. This was the dark omen confirming the siege was inevitable.
Leaving the Byzantines with only that meager foreign aid they'd managed to secure.
Exactly. Giustiniani's Genoese contingent, Cardinal Isidore's archers, a few others. It was a heroic but tiny force against the might of a rapidly mobilizing empire poised for the kill. Hashtag Chapter 2. The siege begins. Hashtag JAGTAG 2, 2.1. The fleet of the Bosporus. The Ottoman Armada approaches.
The siege officially commenced on April 6, 1453. Let's start with the sea, where the naval imbalance was pretty stark. Mehmed had focused immense resources on creating a fleet specifically for this confrontation.
He really had. The size of the Ottoman fleet is often exaggerated in early accounts. You see figures in the hundreds.
Wild numbers sometimes.
Right. But modern historians place a more realistic estimate at around 110 ships. That's still substantial, and crucially included about 70 large war galleys.
And they were well manned.
Yes. Mehmed had employed experienced sailors, including many Spanish Christian mercenaries from Gallipoli, ensuring these ships were crewed by capable hands.
Contrast that with the defenders' fleet. It sounds tiny in comparison.
Pitifully small, really. The defenders fielded a mere 26 ships in total. Only 10 of those were actually Byzantine vessels.
And the rest?
The other 16 were foreign ships, allies from Genoa, Venice, the Kingdom of Aragon, even France. Admiral Suleiman Baltoglu commanded the Ottoman fleet with the immediate task of locking down the entrance to the Golden Horn.
That crucial inner harbor.
Exactly, and preventing any more foreign ships from entering to resupply the city. Even though Mehmed's main focus, his main effort, was aimed squarely at the land walls from the west, controlling the sea was absolutely paramount to strangling the city's lifelines. Hashtag 2.2 cannons of Doom Urban's Great Bombards and the New Warfare.
Now for the main agent of change in the siege, the artillery. And this wasn't just a lot of cannons. This was an entirely new scale of destructive power.
It truly was. Mehmed brought an artillery train of approximately 70 large pieces from Modern. The capability was unprecedented for the time.
How powerful are we talking?
We're talking cannons that could repeatedly fire massive stone projectiles, some weighing over 500 kilograms, that's 1,100 pounds, over a distance exceeding 1.5 kilometers, nearly a mile.
Firing something that heavy that far.
It's incredible. This capacity for sustained heavy bombardment was the element that fundamentally undermined the defensive geometry of those ancient Theodosian walls. They just weren't built for that kind of impact.
And the symbol of this new power was the gargantuan cannon known as the basilica, forged by this figure named Orban.
Yes, Orban. He was either Hungarian or possibly German, a mysterious and obviously very skilled cannon founder. The story goes he first offered his services to Emperor Constantine.
But the Byzantines couldn't afford him.
Tragically, no. The imperial treasury was practically empty. So Mehmed stepped in, gave Orban basically a blank check, all the funds and materials he demanded.
And the result was this monster cannon.
The result was the 27-foot-long basilica, capable of hurling a 600-pound stone ball over a mile. Orban apparently boasted that this weapon could blast the walls of Babylon itself. Hyperbole, maybe, but it gives you a sense of the confidence or arrogance involved.
But even weapons of mass destruction, especially new ones, have their flaws. What were the operational challenges of the basilica?
Oh, the limitations were severe and actually quite significant. It took something like 3 hours just to reload the basilica, making the rate of fire incredibly slow.
3 hours between shots.
Yes. And they had a limited supply of both the specialized gunpowder and those massive stone balls. Furthermore, the sheer physical stress on the cannon itself was immense. Although it's disputed in some sources, there were reports suggesting the basilica actually cracked or even collapsed under its own ferocious recoil after about 6 weeks of firing.
So it wasn't the only factor.
Definitely not. We have to acknowledge that while Orban made the famous one, the showpiece, highly skilled Turkish engineers, particularly a man named Saruka, were responsible for casting, sighting, and maintaining the bulk of the 70 or so heavy pieces in the Ottoman train. It was a team effort, technologically speaking. Hashtag tag 2.3, the cross and the crescent, religious fervor and morale.
Let's compare the military forces on the ground now. On one side, you have the colossal organized might of the Ottoman army.
The sheer number was overwhelming. Modern estimates suggest Mehmed commanded somewhere between 50,000 and 80,000 soldiers. That's a huge force for the period.
And the core of that force?
The core included the terrifying elite, 5,000 to 10,000 janissaries. These were the Sultan's personal standing infantry force, composed mainly of converted Christian boys taken as slaves, raised in Islam, and intensely loyal only to him.
A unique fighting force.
Absolutely unique. This structural loyalty directly to the Sultan over land or lineage made them incredibly disciplined and virtually fearless in battle. They were the shock troops par excellence.
You mentioned other units earlier, too, like the Azaps and Ghazis. Can you clarify their roles compared to the Janissaries?
Yes, that distinction is vital to understanding Mehmed's assault strategy. The Ghazis were often frontier fighters, volunteers driven by religious zeal for holy war. They were the ones often stirred up by criers in the camp to lead the charge, full of fervor, but maybe less discipline.
Okay.
The Azaps were irregular light infantry, often poorly armed and armored. They frequently served as expendable shock troops in the first waves of an assault. Their main purpose, frankly, was to absorb casualties, soak up the defenders' arrows and energy, and tire them out.
Cannon fodder, essentially.
Pretty much. Mehmed expertly used these less-trained units to exhaust the Byzantine professional soldiers before deploying the fresh, disciplined janissaries for the decisive push. And critically, he also forced his vassals to contribute troops, including about 1,500 Serbian heavy cavalry under Ura Branković, even though Branković was Christian.
And the Byzantine defense, a tiny professional corps bolstered by desperation.
Precisely. Total Byzantine professional strength was, perhaps, optimistically, 7,000 to 10,000 men. And about 2,000 of those were the foreign mercenaries, mostly the Genoese under Giustiniani.
So the brave.
Many defenders were armed civilians, townsfolk, even monks pressed into service. Brave, certainly, but not professional soldiers. Constantine VIII and his small band of loyal Greek troops were strategically positioned at the most vulnerable point, the Mesotapian, that middle section of the land wall near the St. Romanus Gate, which had been heavily weakened by the cannon bombardment.
And Giustiniani joined him there.
Yes. Recognizing the gravity of the situation and the focus of the Ottoman artillery, Giustiniani moved his well-equipped Genoese from the northern Parisian gate to reinforce the emperor at this crucial defensive linchpin. It was where the fate of the city would likely be decided. Hashtag 2.4 diplomats in desperation. The West watches and waits.
Early in the siege, after the initial shock of the bombardment wore off slightly, Emperor Constantine was forced to confront the impossible math of his defense, wasn't he?
He absolutely was. He ordered a comprehensive census of able-bodied men within the city. His close friend and chancellor, George Francis, recorded the grim tally. Only 4,773 native Greeks capable of bearing arms.
Only 4,773 Greeks.
Lost the foreign contingent, maybe another 2,000 or so. This meant a mere handful of men for every section of the vast, nearly 12-mile perimeter of walls.
An impossible task.
Utterly impossible. They could barely afford to man the outer defenses adequately, let alone maintain any kind of meaningful reserve force for counterattacks or plugging breaches.
Despite the ongoing siege and the clear military advantage, Mehmed actually offered Constantine an escape route midway through the ordeal, didn't he?
He did, which is interesting. Midway through the siege, the Sultan sent an envoy offering to lift the siege entirely if Constantine simply surrendered the city.
What were the terms?
He sweetened the deal considerably. He promised the emperor the Peloponnese, that remaining Byzantine territory in Greece, as a semi-autonomous governorship, under Ottoman oversight, of course, and he guaranteed safety for the citizens who wished to remain in Constantinople, and safe passage for those who wished to leave with their possessions.
That must have been a tempting proposition for a ruler facing almost certain obliteration.
Extremely tempting, you'd imagine. A chance to survive, to rule somewhere else, to save his people from slaughter and enslavement.
But Constantine's refusal really cemented his legacy as the last Roman emperor. He chose a warrior's death over what he saw as dishonor.
His stance was completely uncompromising. He rejected the surrender outright. He replied that he would only agree to pay a higher tribute to the Sultan and formally recognize existing Ottoman conquests, but giving up the city itself was unthinkable.
And his famous response?
His famous defiant response, as recorded by historians, captures the dignity, perhaps the tragic dignity, of the doomed empire. As to surrendering the city to you, it is not for me to decide or for anyone else of its citizens, for all of us have reached the mutual decision to die of our own free will without any regard for our lives.
Wow, powerful words.
Incredibly powerful. This commitment to death over capitulation, while perhaps strategically futile, became a potent source of inspiration for the exhausted defenders in those final desperate weeks. Hashtag 2.5, the first assault's blood on the ramparts.
The early weeks of the siege, sort of from mid-April into May, were a study in counterpoint. You had the overwhelming roar of the cannons on one side versus the gritty, almost desperate hand-to-hand defense on the other.
That's a good way to put it. The initial assaults, often probing attacks or attempts to storm early breaches, really highlighted the limits of the new artillery, initially at least.
How so? The cannons were doing damage, surely.
Oh, they were doing immense damage. But the Byzantine defenders proved surprisingly adept at damage control in those early stages, because the largest bombards, like the Basilica, required those 3 grueling hours to reload.
That slow rate of fire again.
Exactly. It gave the Byzantines a window. After each massive shot, they could rush out under fire, desperately fill the breaches with whatever they could find, rubble, timber beams, barrels packed with earth, anything trying to shore up the wall before the next shot landed.
So the walls were weakening, but not yet collapsing entirely.
Right. They were crumbling, sections were turning to powder, but the defenders were just managing to hold them together, patch them up enough to repel the infantry assaults that followed the bombardments. It was exhausting, deadly work.
But what must have been truly terrifying for the defenders was the tenacity and singular purpose of the Ottoman infantry, especially those janissaries. They fought with an intensity that Christian forces perhaps rarely matched at this time.
That comes through very clearly in the eyewitness accounts. The Venetian surgeon Niccolo Barbaro, whose diary provides such a vivid, terrifying glimpse into the siege. He noted this specifically.
What did he say?
He described the extraordinary courage and discipline of the janissaries. He wrote how they would relentlessly advance into breaches under heavy fire and how they would retrieve their dead and wounded comrades regardless of the danger, none fearing death, he wrote, rather than suffer the shame of leaving a single Turkish corpse by the walls.
That's more than just individual bravery.
It absolutely is. This wasn't just heroism. This was military doctrine. It was unit cohesion pushed to the extreme, an unnerving dedication to the Sultan and the cause that signaled a new, relentless, and frankly terrifying kind of warfare that the defenders were facing. Hashtag tag chapter 3, life under siege. Hashtag tag 3.1, hunger and faith. The city's spirit under pressure, the internal struggle within the city walls as the siege dragged on into May was becoming brutal. Supplies were dwindling rapidly, hunger was setting in, and despair was a constant companion.
A grim existence.
Incredibly grim. But even amidst that darkness, there were moments of profound morale boost, flickers of hope that kept them going.
And the most dramatic of these moments came on April 20th, involving those ships we mentioned earlier.
Yes, that was a truly remarkable event. A tiny flotilla of 4 Christian ships, 3 Genoese galleys commissioned by the Pope carrying vital supplies, and 1 large imperial transport ship loaded with grain from Sicily managed the seemingly impossible.
They ran the blockade.
They didn't just run it, they fought their way through it. They engaged Admiral Boltoglu's entire blockading fleet in a fierce naval battle right at the entrance to the Bosphorus, in full view of the city walls.
The defenders must have been watching, holding their breath.
You can only imagine the tension. And against all odds, these 4 ships broke through the Ottoman lines and sailed triumphantly into the Golden Horn Harbor.
What an incredible boost to morale that must have been.
Tremendous. The sight of those ships arriving safely, delivering vital grain and reinforcements, was a huge psychological victory for the besieged defenders. It showed resistance was still possible.
And conversely, a disaster for the Ottomans.
A colossal and intensely humiliating failure for Sultan Mehmed. He was reportedly so enraged by Boltoglu's failure to stop just 4 ships with his entire fleet that he rode his horse into the sea shouting commands. Afterwards, he stripped the admiral of his wealth and rank, handed his property over to the janissaries as a reward, and famously ordered him publicly whipped 100 times.
Wow. That shows how seriously Mehmed took any setback.
Absolutely. It confirms just how high the stakes were and how seriously he viewed any naval incompetence that might allow the city to be resupplied.
As the siege neared its inevitable climax, the city turned inward, didn't it? Seeking spiritual solace and perhaps a final moment of unity on the night before the final assault.
Yes. On May 28th, with the final Ottoman assault clearly imminent, mass religious processions swept through the city streets. People carried icons, relics, praying for a miracle.
A city united in prayer.
united in desperation, perhaps. This culminated in a deeply symbolic and moving event, a solemn last ceremony of Vespers held in the great church of Hagia Sophia. And crucially, in this final act of collective faith, representatives of both the Greek Orthodox and Latin Catholic churches stood together, prayed together.
Setting aside their differences at the very end.
Momentarily, yes. United in shared, desperate prayer, they briefly set aside centuries of schism, bitterness, and hatred. It was a poignant final moment of Byzantine unity before the storm broke. Hashtag 3.2 Women and Priests, the Unseen Defenders.
We often focus, understandably, on the soldiers manning the walls, the emperor, the commanders. But the defense of Constantinople was really a total civic effort, wasn't it? The entire remaining civilian population had to mobilize just to keep the city functioning under siege.
Absolutely. The role of non-combatants, women, priests, monks, ordinary citizens was absolutely crucial to prolonging the defense as long as they did.
What kinds of tasks were they undertaking?
All the essential support tasks that the soldiers couldn't do. Citizens were constantly out there under fire, repairing the breaches in the outer walls alongside the soldiers, carrying stones and timber. They stood guard on less threatened sections of the walls. They organized the collection and, importantly, the rationing and distribution of the rapidly diminishing food supplies.
Keeping the defenders fed, however poorly.
Exactly, and perhaps one of the most desperate tasks, keeping the foreign mercenaries paid. Money was running out. People donated gold and silver objects from their homes. Churches contributed their sacred vessels. Anything of value was collected to be melted down into emergency coins.
Why was paying the mercenaries so critical?
Because unlike the native Byzantines fighting for their homes and lives, the loyalty of many foreign soldiers, particularly the Italians, often depended on continued payment. If the money stopped, they might leave, or their morale would certainly collapse. So the civilian effort to find precious metals was vital for keeping those professional soldiers on the walls.
And it's interesting, even within Mehmed's world, or at least the broader Ottoman sphere, there were examples of loyalty to the old emperor, Constantine XI.
Yes, that's a fascinating detail that often gets overlooked. There was a Turkish commander named Dorgano. He wasn't an Ottoman subject. He was actually a Turkish mercenary captain employed directly by the Byzantine emperor.
A Turk fighting for the Byzantines?
Yes. He and his contingent of loyal, paid Turkish troops guarded a specific seaward quarter of the city. And according to the sources, these Turks remained faithful to Emperor Constantine until the very end. Dorgano and his men perished, defending their assigned section of the walls during the final assault.
That really speaks volumes about the complex tapestry of loyalties and identities in the 15th century Balkans, doesn't it? It wasn't always a simple Christian versus Muslim conflict.
Not at all. Personal loyalties, mercenary contracts, regional affiliations. It was a much more complicated picture than we sometimes imagine. Hashtag 3.3, the chain across the Golden Horn engineering and ingenuity.
Let's talk about the Golden Horn again. The Byzantine defense relied heavily on that massive defensive chain stretched across the mouth of the harbor. Why was that chain so important?
It was absolutely critical. It was a measure enacted precisely because the seaward walls along the Golden Horn were historically the weakest link in Constantinople's defenses.
Weaker than the land walls.
Significantly weaker in places. Remember, it was via the Golden Horn walls that the Crusaders of 1204 had managed to breach the city. The Byzantines hadn't forgotten that lesson.
So the chain was their solution.
Yes. It was a brilliant, necessary piece of heavy engineering, a massive iron chain floated on large wooden logs stretched across the harbor entrance from the city proper to the Genoese colony of Galata on the other side. It created an impassable barrier for enemy ships.
And this allowed Constantine to focus his limited forces.
Exactly. By blocking direct naval access to the vulnerable Golden Horn walls, Constantine could gamble on concentrating nearly all his precious few soldiers on defending the heavily battered landward walls, where he expected the main Ottoman assault.
But Mehmed's countermove against this chain is perhaps the single most famous feat of military ingenuity during the entire siege. It sounds almost unbelievable.
It was audacious, brilliantly conceived, and physically demanding on an epic scale. It happened around April 22nd. Mehmed, frustrated by his fleet's inability to enter the Horn, decided to bypass the chain entirely by going overland. He ordered the construction of a roadway made of greased logs, smooth timbers coated with olive oil, animal fat, tallow, various lubricants stretching over the hill of Galata. Galata was technically neutral, controlled by the Genoese, but they were powerless or unwilling to stop him.
He built a road over a hill.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
A slipway. And then, using thousands of men and teams of oxen, he literally dragged over 70 of his smaller ships, galleys and lighter vessels, up the hill, across the peninsula of Galata, and down the other side, launching them directly into the waters of the Golden Horn, completely behind the defensive chain.
Dragged 70 ships overland? That must have been a crushing psychological blow to the defenders waking up to see that.
Utterly demoralizing. Imagine looking out one morning to see an Ottoman fleet suddenly materialized inside your supposedly secure harbor. Tactically, the move was devastating too.
How so?
It immediately threatened the city's weaker Golden Horn walls, forcing Constantine to divert precious troops away from the land walls to guard this new front. It also compromised the defenders' supply lines that sometimes ran through Pera, the Genoese colony adjacent to the route Mehmed had used. It just made an already desperate situation exponentially worse overnight. A stroke of genius, albeit brutal.
Hashtag 3.4 night raids and fire ships, acts of defiance.
Faced with this new, unexpected naval threat right inside the Golden Horn, the Byzantines were forced to try and go on the offensive, weren't they? Attempting desperate, high-risk maneuvers.
They had to try something. With Ottoman ships now able to potentially attack the weaker seawalls from within the harbor, the Byzantines mounted a major counter-effort on the night of April 28.
What was the plan? The plan was to use fire ships, old vessels packed with flammable materials, to sail amongst the anchored Ottoman fleet in the Horn and set them ablaze under the cover of darkness. A classic tactic against wooden ships.
Did it work?
No, unfortunately, it failed disastrously. The raid seems to have been poorly coordinated, perhaps betrayed by Genoese sympathizers in Galata. The Ottomans were alerted, ready for them. They sank the fire ships and inflicted severe casualties on the Byzantine and Italian crews involved. It was a costly failure, losing precious resources and men.
And this failure seems to have led to a horrific escalation in violence, a cycle of brutal retaliations.
Yes, the atmosphere of desperation and bitterness intensified sharply after this failed raid. The Ottomans immediately responded with shocking brutality. They took about 40 captured Italian sailors from the raid, impaled them on sharp stakes, and displayed their dying bodies right across the harbor, directly in sight of the city walls.
Pure psychological warfare.
At its most gruesome. Designed to terrify and demoralize the defenders. And the defenders, pushed beyond endurance, responded in kind, immediately and without hesitation.
What did they do?
They brought out about 260 Ottoman prisoners. They held soldiers captured in earlier skirmishes onto the ramparts overlooking the Ottoman camp, and they executed them one by one, hanging or perhaps beheading them in full view of the besieging army.
An eye for an eye, quite literally.
Exactly. By this point, any remaining rules of war, any sense of chivalry, had completely broken down. The conflict had descended into a merciless existential fight to the death, marked by extreme cruelty on both sides. Hashtag Hecker 3.5, letters from the walls, voices of hope and despair.
While the cannons relentlessly pounded the upper ramparts, creating those breaches below the surface, another, quieter war was being waged, a subterranean conflict of mines and countermines.
That's right. From about mid-May onwards, the Ottomans intensified their efforts to break through the walls by constructing tunnels or mines underneath them.
What was the goal of the mining?
The idea was either to tunnel completely under the foundations and emerge inside the city, causing chaos, or, more likely, to dig chambers beneath the walls or towers, pack them with gunpowder or flammable materials, and then collapse entire sections of the fortifications from below. A classic siege tactic.
Who was doing the digging for the Ottomans?
They were relying heavily on experienced miners, many of whom were Serbs sent from the rich silver mines of Novo Brudo, which was under Ottoman control. These operations were directed by one of Mehmed's commanders, Zagan Pasha. This was a sophisticated attempt to use the element of surprise and undermine the defenses in a way that cannons couldn't always achieve.
But the Byzantines discovered an effective counter-strategy, didn't they? Thanks largely to a foreign expert.
Yes. Their savior in this underground war was a German engineer named Johannes Grant. He was apparently attached to the Genoese contingent, though some sources say Scottish. Regardless of his origin, Grant was clearly brilliant at this type of warfare.
How did he counter the mines?
He organized the Byzantine countermining efforts with great skill. His teams dug listening tunnels. They used sophisticated techniques, like placing drums with pebbles or bowls of water on the ground to detect the faint vibrations of the Turkish sappers digging nearby. This allowed Byzantine troops to pinpoint the enemy tunnels and intercept them.
And this countermining was successful.
Highly successful and absolutely essential to prolonging the defense during May. the Byzantines successfully intercepted and destroyed at least 4 major Ottoman tunnels. The sources give specific dates: May 16th, 21st, 23rd, and 25th.
How do they destroy them?
Often by breaking into the enemy tunnel and fighting the sappers hand-to-hand in the dark, narrow confines. Or, more terrifyingly, by using their secret weapon, greed fire, pumping it into the tunnels to burn the Ottoman miners alive.
A horrific way to fight.
Truly horrific. The final victory in this underground war came on May 23rd, when the Byzantines managed to capture 2 Turkish officers who had been supervising the mining. Under torture, these officers revealed the location of all the remaining Ottoman tunnels.
So they neutralized the threat from below.
Completely. The subterranean threat was neutralized. It was a huge temporary relief for the defenders, but it also underlined just how exhausted they were becoming, fighting threats from above, below, and all around. Every success just bought them a little more time. Chapter 4, the final storm. #5E.1, the great bombardment walls shatter under thunder.
By late May, after nearly 7 weeks of relentless siege, the cumulative effect of the bombardment, the mining attempts, the constant skirmishes began to tell decisively. The final mobilization for the general assault began on the evening of May 26.
Yes, this wasn't a spontaneous decision. This was a carefully planned, deliberate process. It involved 36 hours of continuous, intense preparation and mobilization throughout the Ottoman camp. This concluded with a mandatory day of prayer and rest for the entire Ottoman army on May 28th, building spiritual fervor and allowing the troops one final respite before the all-out attack.
The scale of the artillery's impact by this time must have been immense.
Truly devastating. By the eve of the final assault, historians estimate the Ottomans had fired something like 5,000 large cannon shots. That consumed an enormous amount of gunpowder, maybe over 55,000 pounds of it.
And the effect on the walls?
The repeated shock waves and direct impacts had pulverized entire stretches of the outer wall, turning sections into little more than sloping mounds of rubble. Even the massive inner wall was now dangerously weakened in several key areas, particularly around the St. Romanus Gate in the Mesotiecian Valley. The defenses were visibly crumbling.
While the walls crumbled, the defenders were physically exhausted from weeks of continuous repairs and fighting. And then came the final psychological blow, the definitive news from the West.
That's right. That news arrived on May 27th, just 2 days before the end. It was delivered by a small Venetian reconnaissance fleet that had slipped through the blockade. Their message was bleak. They had searched the Aegean Sea extensively, and there was no large Venetian relief fleet on its way.
No help was coming.
None. This confirmed the defenders' utter isolation. The walls were rubble, the men were depleted in numbers and energy, food was running out, and now they knew for certain. They faced the final assault utterly alone against overwhelming numbers. Hope, realistically, was extinguished. #7E.2, the night before the end, Constantine's last speech.
That final night, May 28th, must have been one of the most solemn and emotionally charged in history. You mentioned the mass processions, culminating in that unifying ceremony in the Hagia Sophia.
It truly was the last moment of collective identity and reflection for the remaining citizens of defenders of what was left of the Roman Empire. Constantine knew he had done everything humanly possible: repairs, diplomacy, rallying his troops. His final public stance remained the one he had stated midway through the siege. He would not surrender the city.
No surrender, only tribute.
Exactly. He rejected any suggestion that he should flee the city to save himself. He was determined to stay and die with his people, defending his capital. While there's no verbatim record of a specific final speech like you might see in movies, his actions and previous statements made his intentions crystal clear. He would fight to the end.
Meanwhile, across the lines in the Ottoman camp, the atmosphere must have been completely different. A frenzy of activity and anticipation preparing for the dawn attack.
Absolutely. The Ottoman camp was alive, buzzing with energy and controlled tension. You would have heard the sound of blasting horns, beating drums, and the chants of religious criers moving through the tents, rousing the Ghazis and the regular troops, psyching them up for the final battle.
Total mobilization.
Total. Mehmed issued strict orders. Anyone who showed cowardice or refused to fight would be immediately executed by special officers positioned behind the lines. But he also promised immense rewards: the traditional 3 days of plunder for the soldiers who breached the walls, riches beyond imagination, slaves, and, for those who fell, the ultimate reward of martyrdom in paradise. The stage was meticulously set for the final brutal confrontation, scheduled to commence shortly after midnight. #5E.3, the dawn attack, chaos and courage.
The general offensive began, as planned, shortly after midnight on Tuesday, May 29th. And Mehmed didn't just throw everyone at the walls at once. He utilized a sophisticated and, frankly, horrific strategy of successive waves. Why?
It was a tactical masterpiece designed specifically for attrition. The goal was to break the spirit and shatter the physical endurance of the already exhausted, outnumbered professional Byzantine and Genoese defenders before his best troops were even committed.
So wave one.
The first wave, launched in the pre-dawn darkness, was composed primarily of the cheapest, most expendable troops. The irregular Azaps, Balkan conscripts, and other Christian levies fighting for the Ottomans. They were essentially cannon fodder.
What was their specific role?
Their role was simply to rush the breaches under the cover of noise and darkness, absorb the defenders' initial volleys of arrows, crossbow bolts, and stones, and generally exhaust the defenders' energy and, crucially, their limited ammunition. They weren't expected to succeed, just to soften up the defense.
And the second wave was designed to maintain that pressure.
Exactly. After maybe 2 hours of fierce fighting, the first wave was withdrawn and the second wave was sent in. This was composed primarily of better equipped, but still not elite Anatolian Turkmen forces. They had better arms and armor and were expected to press the attacks on the breaches that the first wave had already suffered in weakening.
Did they make progress?
They fought hard and actually briefly managed to breach a section of the weaker Black Chernay wall in the northwest corner of the city. However, the defenders, though battered and losing men, managed to rally under Justiniani's command and repel them in fierce hand-to-hand fighting.
So, 2 waves repulsed, but at great cost to the defenders. And finally, after hours of this relentless fighting, came the hammer blow.
The third wave.
Yeah.
Launched probably around sunrise. This was the fresh, disciplined, heavily armored, and terrifying core of the Ottoman army. The Janissaries.
The elite.
The elite. They advanced in perfect order, with drums beating towards walls that had now been relentlessly pounded by artillery for weeks and defended by men who had been fighting nonstop for hours against waves of expendable shock troops. The defense was stretched beyond its breaking point, and the Janissaries focused their attack like a spearhead right at the most damaged section of the Mesotician, near the St. Romanus Gate, where the outer wall was little more than a rampart of rubble. #IV.4. The fall of the gate, Justiniani's wound, and the breaking line.
The critical moment, the point where the defense finally fractured, seems to be directly attributable to the fate of one crucial leader. Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, the Genoese general commanding the defense of the land walls.
Yes, Giustiniani was the linchpin. He was the experienced professional soldier, the commander the mercenaries trusted, the strategist coordinating the defense at the most critical point. He was the glue holding that increasingly fragile defensive line together.
And what happened to him?
During the height of the Janissary assault, probably while directing the defense near the main breach at the St. Romanus Gate, he was grievously wounded. The exact nature of the wound is debated. Some accounts say an arrow or crossbow bolt, others perhaps shrapnel from a cannonball or a culverin shot.
A serious wound, Clara.
Serious enough that he couldn't continue fighting. He had to be evacuated from the front line on the ramparts.
Why was his evacuation, his removal from the wall, catastrophic enough to cause the entire line to collapse almost instantly?
Because his departure, whether he was visibly fatally injured or simply being carried away seeking urgent treatment, triggered immediate debilitating panic among his own Genoese troops. These were the best equipped, most professional soldiers remaining on that section of the wall.
Their commander leaving broke their morale.
Completely. When their commander left the fight, the ordered defensive structure, the disciplined resistance they represented, just shattered instantly. The Genoese began to waver, then retreat from the breach, trying to get back towards the inner wall or the harbor.
Creating a gap.
A fatal gap. At that precise moment, the Janissaries, renowned for their discipline and opportunism, surged forward. One Janissary, a giant of a man later identified as Ulubatlan Hassan, is credited in Ottoman tradition with being the first to reach the top of the makeshift rampart, planting the Ottoman banner. Whether it was Hassan or others, they seized the opportunity created by the Genoese retreat and pressed through the breach where the defense had suddenly collapsed.
So with the main breach now open and the crucial Genoese contingent fleeing or disorganized, Emperor Constantine and his small contingent of loyal Greeks were left completely exposed and overwhelmed.
They were, suddenly isolated, facing the full force of the elite core of the Ottoman Empire pouring through the gap. We should also remember, as a testament to the resistance, that the Catalan contingent, fighting in another section, were among the very last of the foreign troops to hold their ground.
How did Mehmed react to their resistance?
Mehmed later acknowledged their fierce defiance, but in a brutal way. He ordered the immediate beheading of their captured leaders after the battle, a grim reward for their courage. But at the main breach, the final Byzantine defense had simply evaporated in minutes following Justiniani's fall. Hashtag Theodia.5, the emperor's death, the fall of Rome's last heir.
The final moments of Constantine Palaiologos, the last Roman emperor, are perhaps the most tragic, heroic, and ultimately mythologized in the entire history of the city. What do we actually know for certain about how he met his end?
Very little for certain, honestly. The official accounts, written later, conflict significantly, which often happens in the chaos and fog of a city falling in battle.
But there's a dominant narrative, especially in Greek tradition.
Yes. The prevailing and universally adopted Greek legend, the one that resonates most strongly, is that Constantine, realizing all was lost, as the Janissaries poured through the breach, threw aside his distinguishing purple imperial regalia, his boots, maybe his helmet so he wouldn't be captured alive and paraded as a trophy. And then he led a final, desperate, suicidal charge with his few remaining loyal companions directly into the ranks of the incoming Ottomans near the breach, perishing anonymously alongside his soldiers in the street, fighting. He died the death of a hero, fighting for his city to the very last breath.
A noble end. Yet some contemporary accounts offer a less glorious, or at least different version.
They do. The Venetian surgeon Niccolo Barbaro, who was there, claimed in his diary quite starkly that Constantine actually hanged himself at the San Romano gate as the Turks broke through, choosing suicide over capture. Other accounts suggest he might simply have been killed accidentally in the confused melee by Turkish Marines or soldiers who didn't recognize him without his imperial insignia.
So his ultimate fate remains technically unknown.
Technically unknown, though the heroic death in battle is the most widely accepted and culturally significant version. Regardless of the exact manner, the profound historical fact remains. The 1,500-year continuous line of the Roman emperors ended that day on the streets of Constantinople. The final heir to Augustus Caesar was dead.
The accounts of the subsequent slaughter and plunder inside the city walls once the main defenses broke are truly harrowing.
They convey a level of terror and chaos that modern historians often struggle to fully capture in words. Barbaro, again, wrote a horrifying description of the immediate aftermath, noting that blood flowed thick in the narrow streets, like rainwater in the gutters after a sudden storm.
A chilling image.
And he added that the bodies of the slain, both Turks who fell in the final assault and the massacred Christians, floated so thickly in the waters of the Golden Horn like melons along a canal. The Ottoman troops, following the established custom of war at the time, had been promised, and now took, their 3 days to plunder the captured city for loot and, tragically, for slaves. Hashtag Chapter 5, Echoes of Empire. Hashtag V.1, The Aftermath, Smoke, Silence and Surrender. Those 3 days of state-sanctioned plunder, granted by Mehmed II to victorious soldiers as was the custom, were marked by widespread looting, terrible destruction, and horrific atrocities. Churches and monasteries were systematically stripped of their centuries-old treasures, sacred icons were smashed or defaced, libraries containing irreplaceable classical and Byzantine documents were destroyed, books torn up for their bindings.
And the human cost.
Immense. Vast numbers of civilians who hadn't been killed in the initial fighting were rounded up and captured for the slave markets. There are contemporary accounts describing rape, the impalement of women and children, the darkest aspects of medieval warfare unleashed upon the population.
A city utterly violated. But Mehmed's reaction on the third day, when he officially entered the city, is perhaps surprising given the brutality he unleashed.
It is quite striking. On the third day, Mehmed formally ordered the looting to cease. An eyewitness, the Greek historian Critobulus of Imbros, who later entered Mehmed's service, recorded the Sultan's entry into the conquered city. He described Mehmed riding through the desolate streets, finding the city half in ruins, largely deserted except for the conquerors and the enslaved, and filled with the stench of death and desecration.
How did Mehmed react?
Critobulus writes that the Sultan was visibly moved, reportedly moved to tears by the scale of the devastation. He's famously quoted as perhaps reciting a line of Persian poetry. The spider weaves the curtains in the palace of the Caesars. The owl calls the watches in the towers of Afrasiab. And then stating more directly, what a city we have given over to plunder and destruction, a moment of melancholy reflection amidst the triumph.
And what practical measures did Mehmed take then for the immediate future of his new capital?
The immediate problem was repopulation. The city was empty. Estimates suggest anywhere from 30,000 to 50,000 people were taken into slavery during those 3 days. To make it a viable capital, Mehmed needed people.
So he issued decrees.
Yes, He issued a proclamation promising Christians who had managed to escape or those who could be ransomed from captivity that they could return to the city. He guaranteed the restoration of their houses and property, although many had nothing left to restore. More importantly, he began intensive, sometimes forced, efforts to rehabilitate the city, drawing settlers, Turks, Greeks, Armenians, Jews from all across his expanding empire to repopulate and rebuild what would become his magnificent new imperial capital, Constantinople. #V.2 Hagia Sophia, from church to mosque.
The transformation of the Hagia Sophia, the great church of the Holy Wisdom, the spiritual heart of Byzantium for nearly 1,000 years, really symbolizes the finality of the conquest more than anything else. It had become the last sanctuary for thousands of terrified civilians during the final hours.
It had. As the walls fell and the soldiers poured into the city, a vast throng of men, women, and children had crowded inside the massive basilica, barricading the great bronze doors. They were likely hoping for divine intervention, perhaps remembering ancient prophecies that the enemy would be halted at the Column of Constantine near the church.
That's a desperate hope.
Utterly desperate. When the Ottoman troops inevitably breached those doors, the scene inside turned into a nightmarish chaos, effectively a slave market within the hallowed space. The soldiers immediately began separating the congregation, tying up the young and healthy men and women deemed valuable for the slave markets, often separating families forever. The elderly, the infirm, those deemed useless, were often slaughtered on the spot. Multiple historical accounts, including those sympathetic to the Ottomans, explicitly describe widespread rape and enslavement occurring inside the revered structure itself. A total profanation.
And Mehmed himself presided over the building's conversion.
Yes. Later that first day, Mehmed rode his horse directly into the Hagia Sophia. Contemporary accounts say he was struck with awe, marveling at the sight of its scale and beauty, even amidst the chaos. There's a famous story, perhaps apocryphal, but telling, that he saw one of his Ghazis wildly hammering at the precious marble floor, trying to pry it up.
What did Mehmed do?
He supposedly cut the soldier down with his sword, angrily declaring, "Be satisfied with the booty and the captives. The buildings of the city belong to me," his prize. He then ordered an imam to ascend the pulpit and recite the Islamic call to prayer.
The Adhan.
Exactly. With that act, the Hagia Sophia, the greatest cathedral in Christendom for centuries, was formally converted into a mosque, the Hagia Sophia Grand Mosque. It was a definitive political and religious statement of conquest, a symbol of Islam's triumph that echoed instantly across the entire globe. #V.3, the triumph of Mehmed II, a new Caesar in the East.
For Mehmed II, the conquest of Constantinople was far more than just acquiring territory or plunder. It was the acquisition of the ultimate imperial legitimacy he craved.
Absolutely. This was the culmination of an ambition held by Muslim rulers for centuries, but it was also about inheriting a legacy. By taking the city, Mehmed immediately declared himself Kaiser-i-Rum,
Which means?
Caesar of the Romans. He was explicitly asserting that the Ottoman state was now the legitimate successor to the Roman Empire. By making Constantinople, which the Ottomans initially called Constantini, acknowledging its founder, his new capital, he fundamentally shifted the Ottoman Empire's identity from being merely an expansive frontier sultanate to a true, centralized, world-spanning imperial power, heir to Rome itself.
The symbolic violence used to underline this claim was potent and widely publicized.
Very much so. After the battle, a head claimed by the Ottomans to be that of Emperor Constantine VII was found amongst the heaps of slain. It was severed, preserved perhaps in brine or honey, and displayed prominently on a column in the city for all to see.
A grisly trophy.
Indeed. Mehmed reportedly declared before it that now the glory of the conquest was complete. The empire of the Greeks was finally won, and their religion was completely extinguished. Whether it was truly Constantine's head is debated, but the message was clear.
And how was this news received elsewhere?
The news of the conquest spread like wildfire, carried by ship and messenger across the Islamic world, where it was greeted with tremendous fervor and celebration. It was widely viewed as the glorious fulfillment of a specific prophecy attributed to the Prophet Muhammad regarding the city's capture by Muslims. Cities like Cairo were decorated in celebration, prayers of thanksgiving were offered, and the Sharif of Mecca hailed Mehmed in letters as the Sultan of all kings and sultans, recognizing his new preeminence. #V.4, the end of Byzantium memory and myth.
With the death of Constantine the Siald, who died without an heir, the 1500-year continuous Roman imperial line effectively ended. What became of the last scattered vestiges of the Byzantine Empire?
They didn't last long. The remaining Byzantine fragments, the Despotate of the Morea down in the Peloponnese, ruled by Constantine's rather ineffective brothers, Thomas and Demetrios, and the small, isolated empire of Trebizond on the Black Sea coast could only survive briefly now that the capital was gone. Mehmed turned his attention to them, and both fell to his armies by 1461. The last embers were stamped out.
And Constantine's own family, did any relatives survive?
Yes, his nephews, the sons of his brother Demetrios, were captured in the Morea. They were taken into Ottoman service, as was common practice with the sons of defeated rulers. The older one converted to Islam and became known as Murad. He apparently became a personal favorite of Sultan Mehmed for a time, eventually rising to be governor-general of Rumeli, the Balkans. The younger nephew, also converted, became Mezi Pasha.
Mezi Pasha. He rose high, didn't he?
Extremely high. He eventually became admiral of the Ottoman fleet and later even served twice as Grand Vizier, the Sultan's chief minister. So the imperial bloodline was extinguished in terms of ruling Byzantium, but ironically, it was absorbed right into the highest echelons of the Ottoman administrative and military hierarchy.
The sheer gravity of the event, the fall of such an ancient city and empire, immediately generated powerful, enduring legends, especially within the Greek Orthodox consciousness. We talked about Constantine's heroic death, but why has the Marble Emperor legend persisted so strongly over perhaps more realistic accounts?
Because legends serve a vital purpose, especially in times of catastrophic loss and trauma. The heroic narrative is essential for collective mourning, but also for maintaining hope. The Marble Emperor legend posits that just as Constantine was about to be struck down, an angel miraculously rescued him, turned him into marble, and hid him in a secret cave near the Golden Gate of the city walls.
Waiting to return.
Exactly. Waiting to be reawakened one day to return and retake the city, restoring the Christian Empire. This persistent myth, alongside others like the partial lunar eclipse being seen as a prophecy of doom, or the thick fog and strange light seen around the Hagia Sophia dome being interpreted as the Holy Spirit visibly departing the city. These stories provide comfort, a sense of divine significance even in defeat, and crucially, the promise of an eventual future restoration. They serve as powerful cultural tools against utter despair. V.5, the legacy how 1453 shaped the modern world.
The impact of May 29th, 1453 was felt almost instantly, wasn't it? Fundamentally altering the course of European and arguably global history.
Without a doubt. On a simple cultural level for Greeks, the date itself, 29 May, which happened to be a Tuesday, became an enduring symbol of misfortune. To this day, Tuesday is often considered an inherently unlucky day in Greek popular tradition because of the fall.
A lasting superstition.
Yes, but the real consequences were far, far more profound and tangible than superstition.
One of the most significant, though perhaps debated, impacts was on the intellectual rebirth of the West, the Renaissance. How did the fall connect to that?
This is one of the most critical, though complex, long-term legacies. The conquest and the instability preceding it triggered a substantial migration of Greek scholars who fled the crumbling Byzantine world, carrying with them invaluable classical knowledge and, importantly, Greek manuscripts that were previously rare or unknown in the Latin West.
Scholars bringing texts.
Exactly. Men like John Argyropoulos, who fled before the final siege and taught Greek philosophy in Florence, or Constantine Lascaris, who ended up in Venice and Sicily, and Cardinal Bessarion, who brought his huge library. They introduced vital classical texts, works of Plato previously unavailable in Greek, improved versions of Aristotle, complex Ptolemaic geography, medical texts.
And this fueled the Renaissance.
This influx of original Greco-Roman texts, direct access to the Greek language and the Hellenic philosophical tradition, is widely considered by many scholars to be a key catalyst, a major accelerant for Renaissance humanism and scientific inquiry. It didn't start the Renaissance, but it certainly gave it a massive boost, accelerating Europe's intellectual awakening.
Finally, politically, the geopolitical vacuum created by the fall of Rome's last heir was instantly contested, wasn't it? Who claimed the mantle?
Absolutely. The fall exposed a major power struggle for the legacy of Rome. On one hand, you had Mehmed II himself, proclaiming himself Kaiser Rum, Caesar of Rome, positioning the Ottoman Empire as the new Rome.
And the other claimants?
Later, and more enduringly in some ways, was Russia. Through the marriage of Tsar Ivan III of Moscow to Sophia Paleologina, the niece of the last emperor Constantine the Elpis, Moscow began to articulate the concept of itself as the Third Rome, the successor to Rome and Constantinople, as the center of true Orthodox Christianity. So you had these competing claims for the imperial mantle.
And the city itself, its name evolved.
Yes. While the Ottomans maintained the formal, official name Constantinia for centuries, honoring Constantine, the name used increasingly in common parlance, even by Turks, was Istanbul. This is widely believed to be derived from a common Greek phrase, Istinpolin, Istatiklin, which simply means to the city or in the city.
Because it was the city.
It was the city. But Istanbul only became the sole official name internationally in 1930 with the establishment of the Turkish Republic.
It's clear that the loss of Constantinople removed a vital geographical and cultural barrier, didn't it? It exposed the Christian West directly to a vigorous, unified, and rapidly expanding new foe in the Ottoman Empire. This loss led to a kind of split European response as you look forward.
It really did. The initial shock across Europe was immense, and it demanded some kind of response. But Europe, as we've seen, was hopelessly divided. On one hand, you had the traditional, almost reflexive call for a new crusade. This was championed most strongly by figures like Pope Pius II, who spent much of his papacy trying, ultimately unsuccessfully, to rally the Christian princes for a unified military campaign against the Turk. The old ways.
And the alternative view.
On the other hand, you had more pragmatic thinkers, like the German theologian and philosopher Nicholas of Cusa. He argued for a different approach, perhaps dialogue, understanding, even reconnaissance of this powerful new reality centered in Constantinople. He saw the need to engage with, not just fight, this new power. The fall fundamentally forced Europe to decide whether to continue trying to fight his powerful new neighbor or learn somehow to live with it. That struggle, that tension between crusade and coexistence, really defined the next 2 centuries of European-Ottoman relations.
A truly stunning deep dive into such a pivotal moment. A moment where centuries of tradition embodied by those incredible walls were shattered by technological change, driven by the singular will of a young conqueror, and met by the doomed courage of the last Romans. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the decisive, world-altering events of 1453.